our session. There's like a small switch due to airport schedules. So we will first have Mustafa speaking and Kritia afterwards. So I will. Is he here? No, Mustafa, yes, yes. So, yes, I would like to invite Mustafa Shabir Hussein Mustafa, who is a senior curator at the National Art Gallery of Singapore. He was formerly a curator at the National University of Singapore Museum and the curator of the Singapore Pavilion, the Venice Biennale, featuring Charles Lim, who you can also see outside. So, Mustafa, the floor is yours.
Okay, both very tough acts to follow, but I'm going to try my best. I'm going to also try and speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and if I run out of time, I'm just going to stop speaking. My perspective on the topic at hand is somewhat different. It's not really discussing Hong Kong, but it's really trying to think about a place that I left many years ago, but in many ways has stayed with me continuously, and at times also haunted me as a kind of a perennial issue, that one carries when one thinks about places from which one emerges, so to speak. I just want to thank Parasite, Trina, for having me. And I sort of came up with this title a little while ago because I thought I'll begin the conversation today by meditating a little bit on Eastern metaphysical awareness, which is of course metabolized through the metaphor of the lotus, and the lotus being a very significant symbol, in terms of thinking about how one imagines the possibilities of the East and the materials of the West, so to speak. And often we find questions of the colonial, the decolonial, the imperial, if that is truly a word, sort of slotted within these imagined and often very well constructed, I must say, binaries. So I want to sort of begin with this, and I apologize to Simon because he has heard parts of this talk. So Simon, time to work on your talk. But I sort of find this image totally amazing because this is something that happened about 2 years after the bloody civil war in Sri Lanka ended in 2009. And this was essentially the renaming of a street which used to bear the name of Ananda Kumaraswamy. It was renamed as Nelumpokuna. Nelumpokuna in Sinhala means lotus pond. And I was sort of curious to see why, and we'll come back to who Ananda Kumaraswamy is, why the Sri Lankan state, 2 years after the civil war, a bloody civil war, decides to name a street the Lotus Pond. It turns out that there was really a metallic lotus pond that had been constructed and gifted by the Chinese state to the Sri Lankan state. And in many ways, the renaming of this street went hand in hand with the opening ceremony of this structure. Now, this structure, as you can see, is a sort of a stylized lotus pond. It has all these petals, 14 petals around. And it was in many ways seen as a kind of a stately gift from the Chinese state to the Sri Lankan state, or the people of Sri Lanka. Often states get overwhelmed by this phrase, people. What's amazing is also that this site is also in one of Colombo's most bourgeois districts, Colombo 7. So if you really are somebody who matters to the state, you would be living and operating out of this district. It's really the heart of the city, where the intellectual and the political elite would reside. So this is all quite amazing, that this is all happening. And this is all undertaken by one particular figure whom you see in the image right there in the center. His name is Mahinda Rajapaksa, and he was the reigning president at the time, who had in many ways vanquished the so-called Tamil problem and had unified the island, and had then thereafter gone on to build all these edifices to celebrate this amazing victory of bloodshed. Now, of course, you can see in the image he is surrounded by his military generals and the dancers, at the back. These are the very dancers that you see who are standing in guard at the fringes of the metallic lotus pond. Now, what's interesting to me about this is to sort of return to a moment in 2015. Now, this man here, Mahinda Rajapaksa, got voted out for gross corruption allegations and all sorts of things, and these things happen in sort of third world politics, where you have a ruler and there's democracy, and then of course they turn out to be corrupt, and then the people exercise their ability to vote, and then they kick out this corrupt leader. So, interestingly, in a turn of fate, this metallic lotus pond street transforms back to Ananda Kumaraswamy Mavata. Mavata means lane or street in Sinhala. Now, I was quite curious to see what was happening to this man and who this man was, and why would the state constantly try to reinvent this very particular street. Which brings me to the figure of Ananda Kumaraswamy. Ananda Kumaraswamy, I'm going to sort of tell you 70 years of his life in about 70 seconds. So Ananda Kumaraswamy is a figure who has fascinated me for years now. In many ways, he is, I think, one of the most important art historians of the 20th century, one of the most leading anarchists who operated out of New York City in the early 20th century, and is said to have been really the polyglot figure who metamorphosized and represented all these amazing possibilities, of what I would say, a post-colonial ideal world could look like. So here you have a human being who can not just read and write Sanskrit, but also can read and write Latin. And at the same time can manage Chinese, can manage German, can manage French, but of course can also speak basically this range of languages that make up what is today South and Southeast Asia. Now he leverages upon his interesting biographical background. He's born in Sri Lanka to a Tamil father and an English mother, and ends up growing up in the UK. And over time, as you can see, I just put these images here because he would adopt different garbs at different moments in time based on his various political affiliations. Now, he was also very instrumental for two reasons. The first reason was his political work. His political work really allied or aligned very closely to Gandhian thinking that was emerging in early 20th century India, where there was this sort of sense that the post-colonial in this kind of Gandhian world would be reclaimed through the primary site of the village or the village community. And the pastoral would really be the site from which the colonial would be banished, and all these sort of what you call Western materialisms would be done away with, and an Eastern metaphysical awareness would emerge. So he would align himself with that and sort of produced all these amazing polemics, writing largely out of London and then later out of Boston, because he was also the chief curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So he's really operating out of what you may call a territorial West or a Western context, and writing in English and in German. The second key contribution, in my view, that he makes is to the very discipline of art history. Now, art history understood in the sense where you have to imagine that so much of early 20th century art writing is premised upon the fact or the colonial assertion that these large parts of India and China really don't have a history, that these people are outside of history and that they need to be brought in. Now they need to be brought in through how? Through archaeology, right? So for example, if you see the coffers of the British Museum or what our colleagues in France have in their collections in their museums, essentially this is really constructing the very notion of an India, of a China or whatnot, through the archaeological fragment, the torso, if you think about it. And Kumaraswamy sort of presents a real dilemma to this, because what he does is he begins to actually look at these objects and say, but wait a minute, there might be contextual reasons from which these grand traditions emerge. So what he says is, at the time, that grand globalizing narratives are not just the preserve of the West. That India too had a grand globalizing narrative, that China too had a grand globalizing narrative. He was a lot more Indo-centric, focused less on China, but really this was the claim. And the claim was made as a way, or as part of a much larger anti-colonial struggle. Of course, what happens later on is quite complicated, because by the 1930s, his writings would be reread or misread by all sorts of figures. And I'll come a bit to that. So sort of looking at this very notion of what this phrase, the perverse or perversions, may mean, as a kind of a productive space from which to operate and to think about the past. Now I just want to highlight this sort of early polyglot world. So this is in fact the inside cover of the History of Indian and Indonesian Arts, which was in fact the first survey to actually survey largely Southeast Asia, which he referred to as Indonesia in that sense. And if you look at the publishers, it's incredible. It's published in London, it was published in New York, and published in Germany simultaneously. And the German translation came out in 1927. The translator of this text was this 27. And the translator of this text into German was Hermann Goetz, who would go on to become the first director of the National Art Gallery in Delhi. So these are incredible connections, through which one can, in what I call cosmopolitan influencing, or cosmopolitan infiltration, that you actually take the language of the colonizer and then you sort of turn it into some kind of interesting form of poison, which the former colonizer willingly consumes, and then something else comes out. So, there is all of this context. But at the same time, and this is what I mean by the cosmopolitan infiltration, he begins to enact his own projects. He begins to sort of train, in some ways, a dancer whom he meets in New York City by the name of Stella Bloch, who begins to sort of take on these personas of the Orient. So she begins to sort of perform Balinese dances, Khmer dances, and sort of takes on this garb. All of it largely facilitated through Kumaraswamy's readings of the mystical East, so to speak. But in a sense, there are also stories of agency which are built in, because what happens throughout, during the First World War, is that Kumaraswamy ends up in New York City and later in Boston, largely because he's a conscientious objector to the British war effort. So he refuses to enlist in the British Army. So the British, in some ways, seize a lot of his assets, and he ends up in New York City as a political refugee. And then, of course, begins to enact all these processes. One of the things that he does is he ends up connecting with this particular bookshop called the Sunwise Stern, which had become a real radical site for anarchist thinking and thought. So I thought that the previous presenter ended on this kind of form of anarchism, and I actually think that in many ways anarchism is one of the most misunderstood and least explored ideologies or ideological frameworks of the 20th century. And I think there is real depth and there is real work to be done in this regard in ways that one can actually reread the colonial and not really fall into what I call the severe trappings of classical Marxist readings or sort of severe critiques of capital, in that sense, that there is a kind of a third space that one can occupy. And in some ways, Kumaraswamy's early writings highlight this possibility. So for instance, this image of him and Stella Bloch, you don't really know what's going on. Are they measuring each other, or what's really happening? Yeah? So there are all these sorts of portraits that are in the Princeton archives, which also holds all his materials, of them kind of seated in all these postures of Eastern metaphysical awareness and sort of this, and it's taking over of kind of this Western being of the body of Stella Bloch. But at the same time, he begins to sort of infiltrate into very important key modernists. David Clark, who's not here, has done amazing work on Kumaraswamy's early years in New York City in his doctoral work. And this is new and recent materials that are coming out about his influence on the sort of American modern, so to speak, of the 20th century. Of course, John Cage was a declared disciple of Kumaraswamy, especially reading The Transformation of Nature in Art. And what Kumaraswamy is saying in the colonial milieu that catches John Cage's attention is that, in a sense, is something we talked about yesterday. I think, Pablo, you mentioned it, that these distinctions that you have between art and religion and spirituality, Kumaraswamy was consciously trying to break these down, and he was trying to sort of present this alternative as another way of reading art and art history and the history of art. John Cage, of course, picks up on it, and I can develop a paper on this, but at this point, we are running out of time. Similarly, what Kumaraswamy does is he ends up developing these large repositories of, well, I would say South and Southeast Asian art, of pre-modern materials in American museums. So the question is, what does this all mean, right? I mean, for our topic at hand. What this means is essentially that by the time of, I would say just after the war, 1947, when India gains independence, everything begins to shift. And everything begins to shift in a very radical way. Because the decolonizing imperative, that has already begun during the colonial period begins to take on certain nationalistic sentiments. And so a figure like Kumaraswamy, for instance, in 1977, this is a very important text which includes like some incredible and some of the most important writers of South Asian art, I would say, figures like Gita Kapoor and K.G. Subramania and Senaka Bandaranaike, the Sri Lankan art historian. All these figures, they are essentially saying that through Kumaraswamy, we can actually redeem a very different art historiography that is not possible without him. And in many ways, I'm trying to recall some of the writings by figures like Pato Mittar, who says in his piece Decentering Modernism that interventions by important non-Western thinkers in the so-called Western canon are required and important. So it is not enough to simply say, no, I'm not going to engage with the Western canon as a way to kind of deliberately undermine it. No, you have to have a conversation with it. And in some ways, Kumaraswamy at the time, in 77, presents that possibility that you can actually intervene into this so-called Western canon. So it's part of a much larger decolonizing process of art history. But by the 1980s, things begin to shift significantly. And this shift really comes from Sri Lanka, the land of his birth and also the place where he kept metamorphosizing, right, from a lotus pond to back his name and so on and so forth. And this shift comes because I think, again, a phrase that has been used in our brief earlier, this question of identity politics becomes a kind of important global concern. And a figure like Kumaraswamy is shelved. He's shelved because he is too complex. He speaks too many languages for his own good. And now is the time for identity politics. Now is the time for clarity, and that if one is to reclaim the self from this big bad colonial world, then one has to be very clear about what one's identity is. And it must be fixed somehow. And this fixation comes, or fixing comes, from the nation state as well. So in order to sort of quickly analyze this issue, I'm going to kind of look a little bit at Sri Lanka as a microscope, through which one can look at it. I apologize, the formatting is like this because I actually teach a class on nations and nationalism, so I've sort of taken this from those slides. So just to quickly talk about like 6 centuries of Sri Lankan history, this process really begins during the colonial period. And the colonial period in many ways, and these are well-known facts and arguments, I think, that the colonial censuses constructed race and nationality. In the Sri Lankan case, it appeared first in 1871 and later in 1881. And essentially created majorities and minorities, and then these majorities and minorities would be organized in the colonial economy through ethnic divisions of labor. So for example, the Sinhalese community would be largely composed of the peasantry, whereas the Tamil community would be sort of filling in bureaucratic positions within the colonial bureaucracy, or they would also be working in the estate sector. So there are similarities with colonial Malaya, and so on and so forth. But something else happens in the 19th century, and this is sort of parallel to Kumaraswamy's world, but Kumaraswamy is operating in New York and in London and these very glitzy circles. I mean, in some ways he was what you call the first international curator. You know, he was traveling here and there, and he was really kind of speaking and trying to influence people. I mean, if curators still are able to do that, I don't know. We're often confused as project managers. So that's another lecture for another time. But one thing that happens is the creation of the Mahavamsa. The Mahavamsa is basically an epic, and this epic is being constructed through this tale. And this tale is very simple. That here there was this figure of Dutugamanu, a Sinhala king, who had embarked on this reunification of the island and had recovered territories lost to Elara, a Tamil king, an invading king from Chola. And essentially this myth is taken by later Sinhala nationalists and totally reconstructed and reimagined and redeployed. And by 1956, what happens is figures like S.W.R.D. Bandaranaike. Now I have this wonderful clip of him speaking in this beautiful Oxbridge accent, but he's really talking about Sinhala nationalism and why the Sinhala language is so important. He really didn't speak Sinhala so well, but in 1956 he had totally reinvented himself. A bit like Kumaraswamy in some ways. That is S.W.R.D. Bandaranaike after 1956 when he has enacted Sinhala only policy, and that's him just prior to it in a kind of a full white suit, you know, looking like what they call the Gora, or the kind of the white man in that sense. So there are all these sorts of complexities that are operating, and it's really quite complicated. I'm not even going to get into the leftists of Sri Lanka a little bit, but suffice to say that even there are all these perversions, so to speak, of Marxist thinking, where you have leftist thinkers who are really kind of affiliated with Sinhala majoritarian rules. So how does that work? Like how can you be Marxist and then be going out to kill minorities? I mean, these are all these complications that emerge in the Sri Lankan case. Of course, one of the greatest things that is celebrated around the world was Sri Lanka, as a result of all these so-called perversions, has the first woman prime minister in history. All of this comes together in 1983, when all these different discourses, the intellectual world, the identity politics, so-called, the post-colonial nation state trying to reclaim majorities and minorities, ends up in riots against the Tamil minorities in Colombo. And then you have the the metallic lotus once again emerging. This is a war memorial in Kilinochchi in Sri Lanka, where again, there is no artist mentioned actually. I spent a lot of time trying to walk around it. There is really no artist mentioned. It must have been constructed by, I'm not so sure, I have to find out. I don't know whether the Sri Lankan state will tell me. But you see through the bullet cracks a metallic lotus emerging right in the shade of the Sri Lankan national flag. Which brings me to my conclusion. To Thailand, why Thailand? And I'm wrapping up. Is if you think about China's gift to Sri Lanka in 2011, which was the metallic lotus pawn of the metallic lotus, Sri Lanka itself was also making its own gifts in the 12th century. And interestingly, it was Kumaraswamy who, in his History of Indian Indonesian Art, initially gives birth, so to speak, to this idea. So I apologize, this is actually an extract from a paper, but I just want to read this. As such, in chapter after chapter, chapter after chapter of History in Indonesian Art, he attempts to open up a series of lateral links that flow backwards and forwards within these cognates. He uses this word cognates as a way to think about South and Southeast Asia in a much more lateral kind of a way, that connections are going up and down. It's not just one way. Even Parakrama Bahu I, this kind of mythological Sri Lankan king around whom Mahinda Rajapaksa, I told you, the man who was standing at the bottom edge of that huge edifice he had created, makes a return. No? So this is a quote from Kumaraswamy. In the 12th century, the greatest of Sinhalese kings, Parakrama Bahu I, the Great, recovered possession of the whole island, invaded southern India, and maintained relations with the trans-maritime kingdoms in Siam and Sumatra. Renewed Tamil invasions again wasted the country, and although in the 13th century, under Parakrama Bahu III, Pulau Narwa, again a kind of a relic, archaeological site in Sri Lanka, now abandoned, was again occupied. In 1361, Ceylon was still in a position to respond to a Siamese request for a Buddhist mission. Traces of this Buddhist mission are visible even today at Wat Sichom, very short, the Sukhothai period temple built between 1357 and 1361. So Kumaraswamy concludes, the draftsmanship shows no Siamese peculiarities. On the other hand, it exhibits a very close affinity with that of the Jataka, or the Pali canon frescoes of the northern temples in Pulau Narwa. Intimate relations had long been maintained between Ceylon and Ramana, and a long inscription of 1361 states that in the year a very learned Sangharaja, a Buddhist priest, higher rank, came by invitation from Ceylon to Sukhothai. He was received with great honor, and that in connection with his arrival, temples were built in the mango garden west of Sukhothai. So, I just want to end by saying that, when we are in the midst of evolving concerns, often it's very unclear where one can position oneself, and something that Kumaraswamy just throws away in his book, just like that, in the spirit of anti-colonial agitation and imagination, that Sri Lanka too could have been a colonial power, that it too had the possibility of giving stately gifts, can manifest in the most perverse of ways today. So this is sort of where I want to leave. I leave you with this image as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. Well, since we didn't do any questions and answers after the first two speakers, I think we're going to then decide that we keep this model for all the other speakers. So I will just invite our next lecturer, Gritia Gaviwon, who is the artistic director of Jim Thompson Art Center in Bangkok, well, she's a co-founder of Project 304 in Bangkok, and she is working with Mayam in Chiang Mai, and currently she's also on the 12th Gwangju Biennale curatorial team, and she has recently curated a retrospective of Abhijit Virasta Kun, which was also shown here and in many other places, and also a group show with artists from Pattani, from the Muslim south of Thailand. So, Gritia.
Thank you very much. I think, sorry that we switched the sequence, but I think it might be interesting to have a direct dialogue with Mustafa's presentation, because my talk will start with this as well. I don't know why we use lotus too much, but I think my the interpretation of the lotus in Thailand will quite slightly different from Sri Lanka version, which is it's kind of a subtext of a social political kind of a metaphor. Yeah. So let me, before I forget what I'm gonna speak, so let me read this paper a little bit. So you might wonder how someone from Thailand, with who have a little bit, like almost nothing, to share about this topic, because I think it's even more perverse that I accept this invitation, to speak about a perverse decolonization. But at least I guess I can share the perverse part, and try to establish the connection with you guys later, and looking at the grand narrative about Thailand and in the framework of post-colonial studies. You may have heard already that one of a few countries in the world. Actually, I just Google and see in YouTube like how many countries in the world that has been survived the colonialism, which is 10 countries, and Thailand is one of them. You can see in YouTube channel. So for being independent from colonial power, the question arose, how did it happen and what is the strategy for Siam then, or Ayutthaya before, how it survived colonial power and maintained its own sovereignties, but who know the price that we have to pay, and which lead us to where we are now, which is almost like the dead-end situation. So, but this grand narrative has been reinforced by the nationalist historiography that reject comparing Thailand with the once colonized neighbors. Peter Jackson, he cited the local intellectuals, Nopan Prachakul, stated in the early works of Thai studies on post-colonialism, upon hearing this word, colony, many people probably think that something has long gone. And amongst Thai people in particular, the most common initial reaction is, quote unquote, that's not relevant to us. We Thai have never been anyone's colony. So Peter Jackson argued that such view was not be held globally. He elaborated that the crucial scholars of Thai studies, including with himself, Patana Kiti Asa, who's already passed away, Michael Herzfeld, Craig Reynolds, and Thongchai Vinitjakul. So for Thongchai, who wrote the Siam map, which is quite interesting book, if anyone interested in the history of Thailand and Southeast Asia. His argument about Thailand was it was auto-colonized and by its own rulers and the elite, who was inspiring for younger generation scholars who regularly cited his seminars work as Siam map, which I already mentioned. But Michael Herzfeld called it crypto-colonization, which, and then also Peter Jackson and Rachel Harrison call it semi-colonization, which he took it from the Thai Marxists during the 50s. And I think Mr. Udom, the Thai Marxist, also took it from Mao Zedong, right? Using the word semi-colonization. So in the book called The Ambiguous Allure of the West, The Trace of Colonial in Thailand, which is so interesting because it has been published by Hong Kong University Press. And it's about the King of Siam. Thongchai is looking at the King of Siam and the elite modernize themselves and the country in quest for civilization. And at the same time, they colonize their own subject within. So I'm going to show in these presentations about Thailand. And the way I use this as a metaphor, it's quite interesting because it is mural painting by the monk, in Rama IV period, which is around 10th century. And of course, if you familiar with the Asian or Southeast Asian traditional painting, it's very flat, like 2 dimension, right? And this is the in our the historiography in the Thai art history, we kind of start the westernization by Mark Kro In Pong, or this monk, as the first so-called first modernist, who's introducing those perspectives, in the mural painting. So the right-hand side is quite interesting because He's never been to abroad, but what he saw is the postcard and the commercials from missionaries and from the Westerners, who already stay in Siam, during those time. And then this is like, actually this is the mural painting, but this is the focus. It's about the riddles. I mean, for him, he was ordered by the king, who was then the monk. Rama IV was the king, and King Mongkut. He started to kind of in Thongchai's Vinichakun's the Inquest of Civilization. He interpreted during the Rama IV is very important time because number one, he was really aware about the expansions and how powerful British Empire was. So what you saw here is the lotus pond, right? For this in terms of the Buddhist kind of interpretation, the lotus it means the Buddha and the Sangha and the Dhamma, which is the three kind of important elements, in Buddhism. And on the subtext, politically, this lotus, the biggest one in the pond is called Victoria. Victoria Amazonica, it's Queen Victoria, so it's like a sign, to warn Thai people that we have to be careful because this is very powerful and biggest Victoria lotus, she's like this, in the middle of the pond. So I think this is, see, it's true, right? I don't know if you have this version in Sri Lanka or not. Yeah. Okay, but I think it is quite interesting, to looking at the way he already aware, and then the history of this lotus, it has been kind of discovered, by the British botanists, in Amazon, which is in the early 20th century as well, like 1820 something. And it means the king is really kind of up to date, about what has been discovered in Amazon, maybe through these sailors or through the missionaries, or even he was a good friend of the bishop, Palagua, he studied English with the bishop, English and French, and he also can read and write Latin, Sanskrit, and Bali, which is quite interesting. And so this is one of the anecdotes. And you even can find in the Wikipedia, when he was the monk, they said that he admired Christian morals and achievement as presented by the Wicca, Balagua. But he could make nothing of Christian doctrine. It was then that he made a comment later attributed to him as a king. He said, "What you teach people to do is admirable, but what you teach them to believe is foolish." So this is him, Rama IV, who was the king, and he became the king when he was almost like 40-something years old. And this is, and in like the Western world know him as King Mongkut, and then maybe you saw the film The King and I, right? Which is actually it has been banned in Thailand, so I have to see somewhere else. Until now, it has been banned, right? So it's very interesting how Thailand is not so happy that how we were represented by Hollywood or by the others. But on the other note, besides studying English, Latin, and with the French Catholic vicars, and also he's a good friend of American missionary, right? So he also started his private collection in the garage, like in the royal garage. But he's not interested in showing to the public, because if you think about the birth of the museum, right, in the West, it's always about like you wanted to show through. Of course, you want to show off like your power. It's starting with the ideas of Wunderkammer, right, in the West, and then transform into the public museum. But this one is really started from personal collections, and he wanted to show to the elites, and the aristocrat, as well as the foreigners. And he would show, like he would have took his friends or the guests a tour, a guide tour. And it's quite interesting. But then it has been transformed to like more nationalism, during his son's period, which is King Rama V. But it's really interesting because it's open only once a year, only his birthday. So, like no more people, like, or the public, so-called public, can go in. And then it becomes like a official national kind of public museum after the coup d'etat, of the People's Party in 1932. So this is a short history of how the elites, as if we go back to Thongchai Vinijakun's remarks, on how Siam or Thailand has been auto-colonized, by the rulers and by the elites. This is one example. And then, so how, also to try to understand the past and also the history of the survival, because we are a very small country, right? So we don't even have enough power to fight with the empire. So that's why the only way that I think for the king then, it's like just to negotiate, to use diplomatic relationship. So he sent the diplomatic missions, to France, right? This is in 1861. So this is one thing. And then the other thing which is quite interesting for me is to join the World Expo, okay? As just to represent yourself as a nation. Like, okay, we are an independent country, and we can have our own small pavilion, which is not part of the colonized or even the colony. So I think if you go back to read the history of the World Expo, since the Crystal Palace, it's very interesting the way the curator, spoke with Prince Albert, like how would you design the space, how would you show like the arts or objects from different countries, are you gonna base on geographic, and how would you create exhibition design? Right, and this one, I think before they always kind of divide between the colonizer and the colonized. But for Thailand and Japan and China, we are in somewhere, like between those two spaces. It's pretty interesting the way we did it. But for me, I see it's very perverse because if you look at the Thai Expo pavilion, until today, it still looks like this. I really want to do more research, on how we never change, our kind of identity, and maybe like the national identity or something. But it's always looked like this, Sala Thai, and actually it has been designed by a foreigner, of course, right? And they just want to show who we are. And most of the time, it's kind of replica of the Buddhist temple, those kind of stuff. And of course, a few artists, they're interested in this part of history. So if you bump into some works by Arin or by Abhishek, which I'm going to show later, they're trying to look at the history of this semi-colonization, during the early Bangkok period or even Ayutthaya, right? Because this one is Mongkut, Rama IV, he even create the replica of his crown, 2 crown. He sent it to Victoria and to Napoleon. What does that mean? It's very submissive, right? But the way they use in the diplomatic services, exchanging the royal gift. But you give a replica of your crown, to very strange. Pervert, I would say. But before that, we use this 2 or 3 strategies like diplomatic relationship and trade. We signed treaty, okay, with British. And the first one, it was not so successful. They're not happy, so they sent the fleets, to Thailand. So we have to revise that, right? And then the same as the French. And then we have to do like another thing is self-modernization, which is kind of lead towards the auto-colonization. So this is the past even before Rama IV, in Ayutthaya period. So this is how the first country who went to Southeast Asia, I think it's quite classic, Portuguese, right? The Portuguese were there, and then the French, right? So what we did was the King Narai, he sent the first Siamese embassy to France in 1686. This is the first one, even before Bangkok period. So after this, because this king in Ayutthaya, he was so cosmopolitan, so that the other aristocrats, they felt kind of anti-Westerners. So after this king died, they killed everybody. Like they kicked out all the Westerners out of Thailand. So that's why we've been like closed down the countries, and then we opened up again during the Rama IV, since Ayutthaya to 17, and then we opened up again in 19th century. So this is and again, this, I just want to kind of summarize how we survive, and this is. So what we did in 19th centuries and 20th centuries, almost the same strategies, but this adding up is the king started to went to Europe, and I think he might be the first one from Southeast Asia. Am I right, Simon? Is Rama V is the first one from Southeast Asia who went to Europe? Not the Sultan of Johor. So they are more richer than us. And then he went to Europe twice because of the border dispute. So he just went to negotiate it with the French and the British. And then the other thing that he did with people in the country is he internal colonized us, which is where I come from, the north, the northeast, and the south, almost at the same time during Rama V period. So this is quite interesting, that book called เป็นดังฝรั่งตะวันตก as like acting as Westerners, it's really a kind of anxiety, for the ruler and for the aristocrats, trying to be like Angmo or be like Falang as much as they can. So that's it. And it's really in this kind of consciousness, because they always look down people who speak English like me, because I didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. I speak English like Thai people, the way I speak English. But for them, you have to speak like English with British accent, so this is how they wanted to, they aspire to be, which is quite interesting, for some country, for example, in Singapore, or post-colonial society, you try to create your own identity, right? You have Singlish, you have your kind of version of speaking English, but in Thailand, it's still a case. So I can speak about this later. And then, the way he kind of working closely with missionaries, with all these Westerners, it's quite interesting. But what he did in the country is, again, with sending the diplomatic relationship to England and to France, as well as in the country, the whole infrastructures has been changed. Bangkok used to, the main transportation in Bangkok is the boat, right, through the canal. And then they started to build the road. And then the first road that they built is called the New Road, which is near Chao Phraya River. The reason is very funny, because it's the request from the Westerners that they need the road, for exercise and for the horse, to ride. So that's why the king has to kind of clear up the canals and build the road for the Westerner, and it's called New Road. And then also, we have this as well, like the train system, which is now still the same, like more than 150 years, right? Okay. Treaty, 5 minutes, I can do that. We signed a treaty with the British. who with Sir John Bowring, who was the envoy in Hong Kong, and he kind of served the British Queen, right, to sign the contract with Thailand. And that's how things changed, when we signed the Bowring Treaty. It's very significant moment in Thailand to really I think it's a sign for us. I mean, it's a marking point for us. This is the starting of the semi-colonization. So this is how the kings of Thailand has been perceived, in European visit. He went to everywhere, including with Russia, and take photos with all these kings. He went to Germany as well as in France, and his trip to Italy is quite interesting, and it's very remarkable because it was the time that he saw this artist, Galileo Chini. He went twice, 1897 and 1907. He saw Galileo Chini in the pavilion in Venice Biennale, and he really liked his work. So he invited the Italian painters to paint this throne hall in Hang Anan. So this one, the architect is also from Torino, but the inside, the paint, the mural painters are done by the Galileo Chini, which is very famous painter who was known as European Orientalism. If you go to Palazzo Pitti, his work has been collected by the Medici's family. It's quite interesting. He did a lot of paintings, from Thailand, especially in Chinatown area. And then the king really wanted him to stay longer, but he cannot, after Rama VI. So he got a younger generation artist who just graduated from academy in Florence. His name is Corrado Ferraggi, to work for the king, to not only the mural painting, but to create the monument. So that's why this guy, Corrado Ferraggi, after that, he changed his name to Sin Piercy. And he's a founding father of the modern art in Thailand. So this is the connection between Thailand and Italy. So this is he also introduced this kind of exhibitions, This is the first exhibition that he did, in the main ground. It's about rice. This is the work by Rama V. So I think this is quite interesting as well because after that, because of the dispute between, Rama V annexed the north, the Isan, the northeast and the south. And it's really create the different, the decolonizing attempt in Thailand. I saw it, that's an attempt, by the People's Party in 1932 because they started to the coup d'etat and they kick out the Rama VII, overthrow the monarchy, and then 24th of June in 1932. But it's not really successful because this People Party was in power only in 15 years. So I think the problem of Thailand is the right wing, is still very powerful, the old power and the right wing until now. So the Kasien Tejapira asked these questions the absence of Western colonialist ruler is really sterilized Siam of a nationalist mass movement and its possible radicalization. So it means that it turned out to be it kind of perversely produced, Thais, and then they turn into two directions, either nationalism or communist, right? And this is how it goes. In the Deep South, the Muslim leaders trying to sending the proposal to Siam, to Thailand, that they wanted to practice their own language and practice Islamization on a daily basis. And they were really, really not well received. And later, Haji Sulong, the leaders of Muslim community, he was went missing, in 1950s. So this is another attempt that the Pattani region or the deep south of Thailand is trying to decolonize themselves from Thailand, but it's not successful. It's really complicated. And then in the Cold War, it's another complication. I think we kind of auto-colonize ourselves twice, by the empires, the British and the French. And then on the Cold War, we've become a good friend with the U.S., right? Because of this, the trading, during the Cold War, and Thailand kind of give the U.S. like the spaces, for the air base during the Vietnam War, and in exchange, we get a lot of money for developing our countries, right? So, but on the other hand, it doesn't mean that there is no reaction, from the leftists. So there was this guy who was the intellectual, Jim Pumisak. He translated Marxist, also translate and wrote a lot of writing about art, art for life and art for people, right? But of course, it has been cracked down. I mean, he was killed, in the forest, right? And then all this kind of the leftists against the states, has been portrayed in Pichat Pong's work. So this is one of the pieces that maybe you see in Parasite, in my exhibitions. But it's quite interesting because he got all the archive of these leftist politicians from Isan area who were killed, by the states during the Cold War. And I think it's quite interesting that this is the work of the, how, because the threat is very strong, and we don't even have a tools, to fight with them. I think art might be the last resort, especially for artists. We really have to work on this kind of small narrative, or something that has been oppressed, and trying to bring it to the public, right? So again, like crackdown of the major student movement, in 1970s. Of course, like the Red Church movement of it has been cracked down. The day before yesterday was like 8 years already that we have been kind of defeated by this government. But this is the pretext of the coup d'etat today. This is where Thailand now, because I mean the list of coup d'etats is like about 19 times, already. But it doesn't mean that it's against government. Sometimes they even self-coup. What does that mean? They self-coup d'etat. It's really crazy ideas. And I heard that there will be another self-coup d'etat soon, right? With this government. And this is where they are going at the moment, because they establish these kind of ideas, I mean, this is how perverse it is, I'm interested in the not hyper royalist, but I mean hyper nationalist in Thailand. This is what they kind of dream about. This is just last month, and they have this kind of the festival, I mean, for people. But the thing is, people have to dress up like Ayutthaya period, or even early Bangkok period. But what does that mean? I mean, on the top, the brows is very European, and on this thing, it's not even Thai. It's very Cambodia. But this is for them, this is very Thai, and they're so proud of like dress up like this. Shoes is, of course, like it's from Europe. I mean, I would call it the new government. They said that they wanted to promote the ideas of Thaiism. What does that mean, Thaiism? So this is where you see, and sometimes they even wear this to Paragon. Like, what are you doing? It was really strange. So this is I just want to share you how perverted it is, in Thailand. I don't even know how long that we can auto-colonize ourselves. Maybe we have to kill ourselves first. The same. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Gritia. And we will move on in another side of Southeast Asia with a more optimistic outlook these days. So, politically at least, and I would invite Simon Sun, who is an artist and a senior lecturer in the visual art program at the University of Malaya. And and you can also see his work as an artist outside for a few more hours.
Very embarrassing when I'm calling an artist. More like a con artist.
So, but incidentally, contemporary artists are often great intellectual sparring partners for an art historian like me in offering new imaginative sort of like vectors. And this essay, or at least this presentation, owes in part to the many conversations I have had with the artist Yi Lan, whose work you see here, which I actually will not talk about never ceding the project of the nation or the region to real politics. Critique of decolonization is almost, very often an untextured sort of like demonstration of sort of like self-reflexivity, right? Against any sort of like forms of violence, whether it is state-centered or epistemic. But let's try to instead redeem the project of decolonization here in all its deliciously queer and intimate forms of perversity. I like to think my deliberation is linked in some ways to the conversations about anarchism as a form of self-organizing or as kind of self-fashioning or a form of self-reinvention in some of the presentations that we've heard before this afternoon. So, what is it about batik as a medium that lends itself to 2 centuries-long project of epistemic disobedience across the Indian Ocean? This presentation takes as its premise that decolonization begins the very moment colonization in all its form takes root. What is embedded within decoloniality is also a kind of futurism, always actively informing the shaping of, some kind of tomorrow. And here I propose that we may locate the beginnings of batik as a decolonization project through its spread outside of the Javanese palaces and the cottage industries, which you see in this image here of batik making that they support. The Javanese palaces are also known as kratons, right? From which one category of batik, known as batik kraton, received its name. The word kraton itself stems from the root word ratu, or king in Javanese. In Malayo-Javanese sort of like grammar, one might be able to conjugate a word by adding a pre or suffix to indicate certain states or conditions. In this instance, the word ratu becomes keratuan, right? Which later is shortened to kraton. What does it mean? So in scholar Anthony Milner's sort of like study of the Malay polity, he draws on Oliver Wolter's earlier description of Southeast Asian polities as constituted by competing mandalas, or overlapping sort of concentric spheres of power to locate what holds the mandala together. Milner notes that the word kerajaan, which translates to kingdom or a state, ultimately derives its meaning from, it can be translated to the condition of having a raja. The kraton or the keratuan in this instance is therefore not dissimilar. It's not a dissimilar sort of like Javanese equivalent. Moreover, proximity to the keratuan and its court-sponsored cultural forms was structured along the Javanese aesthetic ideal of halus, refinement, or kasar, vulgarity. What lies outside the kraton's direct sphere of influence then? The answer is perhaps the kasarness of the Nusantara, right? The Nusantara in popular usage has taken on, in today's sort of like, in popular usage sort of like today has taken on the meaning of like a shared archipelagic sort of like cultural geography. But during the Thessalocratic or sea-based Majapahit Empire, it really meant the outer islands, or claims to bodies of waters in between the islands. That's where the word Nusantara, so what Nusantara ultimately means is between islands, and which were considered geographies of secondary registers in the outlier sort of like world from the kraton. It is in the territorial outliers that we find the emergence of a different kind of uptake in how batik has been sort of how batik sort of like has been practiced. Some of its earliest transformation began in coastal court, such as the one you see here. This batik cloth depicts a royal train from the kraton of Cirebon. Various motifs can be seen as presentations for different cultural influences. The wings taken from the Burak birds symbolize the Islamic influence. The dragons, namely the creature with the body of a lion and the scales of a dragon, depicts a mythological animal from China called a qilin, and showcases Chinese influence. The elephant represents the god of knowledge, Ganesha, and the tree of life shows Hindu influence. Such a Creole iconography is demonstrably different from the batik kraton of Java, which you see here. It's very sort of like repetitive and sort of like ordered way of representing different kinds of like patterns, right? And it points in turn to a shape-shifting and open source sort of like possibility as the wax and resist technique of the batik enters into a different cultural world. Here, mercantile sort of like Arab, Chinese, Japanese, and Dutch all constitute themselves as active agents who set up their own workshops that have reimagined batik's form and color, and how the fabric and design played an important role in the reorganization of different kinds of social lives in port cities, in the Pesiseh or the coastal townships, outside of the sumptuary laws of the Kraton. The motif pagi sore, or morning and evening here, and sometimes also known as batik hokokai, or a Japanese sort of like style of batik, is instructive. It was developed around 1930s to 1940s as a result of sustained interaction with some of the Japanese communities during the span of the 20 years that saw a global recession, a Second World War, and the occupation and integration of Java into the Japanese Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Responding in part to the economic constraints of the period, pagi, sore, morning and night, is in its binary form of mutability, offered a kind of two-in-one sort of like batik, with a lighter design that you can use during the daytime, while in the evening a heavier design that you can sort of like put on for evening at night out, right? What the pagi and sore motif signify is batik sort of like code switching ability, so that a merchant of Hadrami descent could as much claim ownership over the production of batik in a coastal town like Pekalongan, shaping a distinct, say, sartorial sensibility that layered Javanese, Arab, and European style into a distinct coastal fashion statement. Equally, Chinese batik makers would just as much translate their love for porcelain blue, common to Ming ceramic wares, into a distinct multi-hue Rococo-esque motif that would line their sarongs, and these were also used in, say, altar cloths which depicted Chinese deities, such as the Eight Immortals, and the decorative use would also enter the domestic universes of Europeans, entering this photo spread in journals and magazines that sought to reimagine what the interior of a modern home would look like. The word here is kud, for the creolization of batik became an imaginative and inventive template that would see the motif take flight in new direction with attempts to transform the batik in Holland's sort of textile industry. The company Velisco came into existence in the 19th century to serve this market. It was its answer to produce batik-like prints. So they were not necessarily batik, but they were batik-like prints for a mass global market. Observe the sample catalog of Velisco, and we can see something else at play. Hitherto undescribed, there's a new kind of effect that became more patently obvious as machine-based production would produce print quality that the Javanese court of the Kraton would consider compromise on many, or will aesthetically compromise on many levels. Here I refer to the crackling sort of like effect, the hair-like spread of spindling lines that spread across the surface of the fabric. These were traditionally seen as undesirable, as it ran against the Javanese aesthetic dictates of kehalusan, or having the quality of being refined. At the same time, other communities saw the crackling effect, and this was distracted by other kinds of aesthetic possibilities, right? If chance became an important artistic device, in, say, early 20th century avant-garde art, batik craftsmen were concomitantly seized by a similar kind of zeitgeist, if you can say, where they were distracted by the potential of crackling as a sort of like technique or device to convey a different kind of energy at play in the universe against the minutiae order of repeated form that you see in the sort of like traditional Japanese craft art. From the early 20th century onwards, the use and polemic of batik in Africa, India, Aboriginal Australia hung and clung on to such a desire, though not always formally faithful to crackling, as has been seen in the photograph of this handsomely and dapperly dressed sort of like gentleman. Suddenly, the permissiveness to reinvent the medium and material with the affectation of color offered a new sense of modern exuberance and confidence in, say, Africa. While in India, following Tagore's visit, Rabindranath Tagore's 1927 visit to Java, the teaching of batik became a core art curriculum in the art school Kala Bhavan in Vishwabharati University at Santiniketan. Batik became the central sartorial choice worn by performers in new ritual dance performances devised by Tagore for the promotion of his faith. What is his faith? His group called Brahmodharma. Brahmodharma, right? Brahmodharma. As a Hindu reformist sort of like movement, it called for a renewal of Hinduism through a rediscovery of its monotheistic sort of roots. And batik was conceived as a kind of textile that facilitated the imagination of this panentheistic sort of like power, as unruly, sinewy lines bloom across the surface of the cloth and stood for a kind of, so almost like a pedagogical futurity, crackling and bristling with energy. Similarly, in Aboriginal, by the 1970s, the Aboriginal sort of like Australians were beginning to sort of like take on sort of like batik as well, introduced initially by a New York artist, but subsequently also by the mid-70s made trips to Indonesia, particularly to Yogyakarta, to attend certain sort of like training workshops there in order to begin to sort of like claim a different sort of like cultural sort of like community that would sort of delink them from the center of Sydney or say Melbourne as the sort of like cultural hub of Australia. Now they were sort of like looking towards say Indonesia, right? So in considering all these three examples, I would liken batik's role in the early 20th century to almost like a kind of print capitalism in fostering a kind of imaginary that vacillates between, say, the nation and the region. Yet what the visual form affords is a kind of fluid space that allows for the use of tradition in producing really sort of like new kind of imaginary against the customs and rules of the colonial and neo-colonial sort of like state. And I think this vacillation between the nation and the region is sort of important. It's never always really sort of like fixed, right? It's a very fluid sort of like register. And these are factors that contributed to the emergence of batik painting in the 1950s in Malaya. Batik painting is characteristically an invented easel painting format using batik drawing and coloring processes as a medium, so using wax and resist sort of like technique as a drawing and coloring process, right, as the main medium. It was soon promoted heavily as a new modern art form in Malaya. The medium was seen as offering a technical innovation consonant with the initiation of a new national imaginary, as Malaya achieved independence in 1957, one in which a traditional craft could be transformed into a modern art form and was able to channel new pictorial possibilities. Art historian Zakaria Ali wrote, "We can argue that the identity of modern Malaysian art in batik by proposing that we have used the sarong for hundreds of years, as noted in early 15th century Chinese text." He also wrote of the medium's affective sort of potency, highlighting batik's sort of sentimental trigger. It is seldom acknowledged that the attempts to historicize batik as quintessentially Malayan or Malaysian, such as the claimable, are really great works of fiction, right? I mean, but honestly, Javanese batik they only began. I think the east coast of Malaya only began sort of like manufacturing Javanese batik in the early 20th century. It was that recent. We had never had a sort of like long history of actually manufacturing such a cloth, right? So recent scholarship has begun to sort of like uncover the economies and discourses of the institutional conceived modernity of Malaysia and the ways in which batik was implicated within such a nationalist discourse. In this context, batik has been, seen metaphorically described as a sartorial skin that wraps and encircles the nation, as suggested by Elan, or as an article of clothing that scripts the subject as a cultural sort of like identity, connecting the body connected to the body politics of the nation. Art not only shaped imagination, but also led a way for the expansion of a batik craft industry. So there was always an economic sort of like impetus underneath all of this. An industry before, such an industry was before only limited to the east coast of Malaya, as I said before. But as batik gained new currency as a signifier of a modern national identity, so these were some of the more sort of industrial sort of like work. It was sort of being manufactured in the 50s and 60s. You can see, much more sort of like modern motifs that suggest of modernity. Rocket, spaceship, the parliament, the national airline, the what's that? The Thomas Cup, which is like a badminton sort of like medal. And then there's factories over there and rubber plantation. So it was quite a sort of like fun use of the medium at that period of time. But as batik gained new currency as a signifier of a modern national identity, an artist was trying to locate a new kind of social compact and moral economy in the batik. And I refer here by concluding this presentation by considering a series of batik paintings addressing homosocial themes produced by a Malaysian artist Patrick Engkar in 1962, the very 1 year before Malaysia was formed. Patrick Ng's batik paintings were first exhibited at the 7th annual exhibition of the Wednesday Art Group held at the British Council in Kuala Lumpur. Reviewing the exhibition, Frank Sullivan, who was a curator and the first director of the National Art Gallery, writing under the pen name Chermin or Mirror, noted, he shows for the first time his brand new preoccupation with batik painting, exhibiting 7 nude figure compositions in brown and white, so reflective that the artist himself could be described as being in a brown study. These brown bodies are also significant because of the slippages at play. There are nudes depicted with the batik medium, a method of painting that had, of course, sartorial origins. Here, the signifier of batik as cloth, as covering, is subverted by bringing the nude body and the batik cloth together. And in exposing the tension between the nude and the cloth, Patrick Ng had also collapsed these two registers of the body. Such a collapse suggests an expression of anxiety in part, the intimation of emotional tension between the two figures, whether platonic or sexual or sensual, underlines a fraught expression of desire within homosociality, right? For academic Michael Hart, this sense of the indeterminate can be understood as the very definition of the homoerotic, in which the ambiguous kind of like tension, and I quote him here, situated on the boundary between the homosexual and the homosocial, relies upon normative male-male relationship, but simultaneously and necessarily invokes what lies beyond that norm, the utopian space of male homosexuality. So, in effect, The painting responded divergently to a discourse of modernism that characterized batik painting as a fine art medium, intersecting a moment where a distinct modern Malayan and later Malaysian art was to be summoned into being. The credited innovator of batik as fine art, around 1955, is Penang-based artist Chua Tian Ting, a painting of his you see here. And his work exemplified what academics such as Hobsbawm and Ranger characterized as a form of sort of invented tradition, right? Though Hobsbawm and Ranger would ultimately sort of like distinguish invention from startling and initiating a tradition, which does not then sort of like claim to be old. Here, batik painting articulated both innovation and tradition, yet it was often exclusively spoken of in terms of its stability as a marker of a Malayan/Malaysian sort of like culture, if we look at the stuff on the right here. Right. How Patrick Ng responded to this milieu to be seen in an oil painting, an earlier oil painting he did. Okay, so I'm going to move forward a bit. 1958, sort of like oil painting, where he is represented with long hair and dressed in a battered outfit with a motif not unlike those we see in his experimentation earlier with a sort of like batik drawing that he did. I don't have a slide for it now, sorry. Writing on the dressing of the body in Malaysian art, art historian Ismail Ahmad has gendered this modality of cultural production. And he notes here, the textile body is a body composed of marks. When coupled with the maternal metaphor, this inscriptive power of cloth to provide intelligibility and meanings to the body is radicalized. In this sense, this mark is not the kind of Islamic identitarian mark that became prevalent in the post-1970s competing vision of Islamism, and as argued by Ismail again, reference to the batik tradition, and I quote him here at length, subdues the cultural Islamicist discourse and is closer to the state's position and its mission to inscribe and legitimize the bodies and identities of its citizens. The result of this is the community and the nation that is held together by symbols summarized in modern Malaysian art through the figure of the mother as a symbol and the body of the nation. But Patrick's sort of like self-portrait does something else here altogether and takes it further. It queers this Malaysian ontology of two register. The first is through a gender shift from male to female by cross-dressing himself as a woman in the self-portrait. The second is a shift from a Chinese to a Malay. Here he makes visible an anxiety of cultural politics that have constitutionally defined Malay cultural markers. After all, as defined by the Malaysian constitution, anyone can become Malay or masuk Melayu. You can enter Malay world, enter or become Malay by adopting Islam and practicing Malay custom. But in doing so, Patrick's performance of cultural competence and mimicry is a challenge to the cultural codification of the period in terms of gender and the racialized body. I mean, in fact, if we sort of look at what is happening in the 50s and 1960s in Malaysia, it has come such a long way from, say, some of the things that were sort of like going on in sort of like Indonesia. And I like to sort of like tie it back to sort of the larger kind of like regional sort of like concern and interest in the batik by pointing to also, for example, Sujojono's sort of like representation of Adesi, who was his former wife and who was in fact a prostitute, but she would also be sort of like seen wearing, say, a typical sort of like kebaya outfit that includes a batik sort of like skirt or sarong, as a way to also then sort of like beginning to sort of like sense that this dislocation or this sort of movement against that sort of like over determination of how batik is being sort of like defined by the Javanese court has longer sort of like roots and history. You can one locate it in sort of like early 20th century, sort of like Java, as well as in say Malaysia in the 1950s, Malaya and Malaysia in the 1950s and 1960s, right? I've prioritized here the speculation. I prioritize speculation as a methodology for queering as a means to locate possibilities in the narrative of a queer art history in Southeast Asia. This animates the artworks and allows us to think through geography as a kind of post-colonial index. Thus, we can recover resonances that might otherwise be sidelined by the narrow purview of nationalism as a politically dominant discourse, right? Such resonances are not altogether unfamiliar to art historical enterprises. We can locate it in the classical ideals advanced by the 18th century pioneer of the field, Winckelmann. Winckelmann argued for a classical paradigm of aesthetic perfection, patterned along ideals of male beauty found in the Greek sculptures, right? For him, this perfection of masculine form corresponds to core humanist values and morality, centered on the notion of personal and political freedom. As such, Winckelmann would also argue that any society possessing such political, social, and intellectual conditions could foster these values. In doing so, his art historical thesis also doubly served as a manifesto. It summoned for and anticipated a neoclassical revival to come. Such a revival would be incarnated in the ideal moral man as represented by the perfection of the male figure. Was there an afterlife to the aspiration of Winckelmann, as it was reflected to the political and aesthetic ambitions of late 1950s Malaysia within an artistic milieu boiled by the democratic spirit of the time, the moment where Malaya achieved independence? We may, in this instance, bring two artworks into comparison. Art educator and mentor of Patrick Ng, Peter Harris's Having a Smoke, 1950, and Patrick Ng's sort of like Bogel or New, 1962, is worth comparing. Both works evince the sculpted form of the male body, staged in the familiar classical pose of contrapposto, right? With a sleight of hand, the conspiring smile of the working class male as he holds his cigarette in his hand, leaning nonchalantly against the pillar with his white singlet rolled halfway up and his midriff exposed, can be seen to possess a new kind of erotic charge when seen side by side with Patrick Ng's nude torso, albeit in a cropped form. In Patrick Ng's painting, the body of the laboring man is brought also into relief. Perhaps he is a fisher, as the background of the painting shows a shoreline. The representation here takes on a class dimension, a bourgeois desire framing the working man's body that toils in the process of nation building. They are fantastical, but tender all the same. We can entertain the possibility that these two compositions resonate with Winckelmann's recourse to European classicism as an inscription of the ideal male body, as a site of freedom. How might this read against, say, for example, Ismail Ahmad's earlier characterization of the two tropes of the Malaysian figure, the dressed body and the displaced body within abstraction, as the locus for the national imaginary? Against this binary is the nude body, where the intersecting history of European classical aesthetic forms and customary Asian artistic processes played out a different register of intimacy. One can perhaps think of Patrick Ng's strategic queering as a demonstration of accomplishment in both Western classicism and Eastern customary aesthetics, while also rendering them strange through a kind of dislocation of these conventions of knowledge within, say, Malaysia. Moreover, the central charge was cited within the ordinary folk, the everyday sort of like demos that constituted the populace of a new country. If they were queer subjects, they were also intimating a peculiar moment. Homoeroticism can have a kind of enabling and leveling sort of effect, holding the power of desire to revise terms of hierarchies and social prescription. Similarly, as noted by Hatt in his study, I'm not going to sort of like go through this. So what Patrick sort of like Bogel here registers is a kind of foreboding of changing sort of like social mores as the decade sort of like progressed. He would very soon leave Malaysia because climate wouldn't sort of like allow for his open sort of like forms of expression. But his engagement with sort of tradition signaled, I guess, an ambivalent sort of outcome. Tradition appeared as a kind of imagined space capable of accommodating non-heteronormative intimacy, yet such intimacy was highly contained within a small milieu, right, in which the fabrication of this narrative was ultimately foreclosed because tradition became a domain to map other forms of political urgencies and heteronormative sexual economies. Nevertheless, I think this reading of tradition that I've presented here demands a more nuanced understanding of its historical deployment, and it resists reducing tradition to a conservative sort of like force, right? In the process of querying, of this process of querying, I think what it signals is an active sort of like refiguring. Then this narrative then achieves the staging of a kind of struggle as one could make objects yield specific kinds of potentialities. Here I suggest before that Patrick Ng's strategic querying can be viewed as a kind of dislocation. In doing so, Patrick Ng's batik painting, produced a year before Malaysia was formed, could be seen as the culmination of the medium's long history of decolonization, fulfilling the futurism of decolonization, while also charting out new intimate vectors that speak against the project of the nation, yearning instead for the time to come of a different kind of region.
And we're going to take a little break of another 15 minutes, so to have the air circulating again. And then we come back for the last two speakers and for the overall discussion. Thank you, everyone.